Hi, everyone. We're just waiting one moment for everyone to join the webinar. So thank you so much for being patient while we wait just one moment. All right, we have a really packed agenda today, so we're going to go ahead and just dive straight in. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening from anywhere and wherever in the world that you're joining us from today. My name is Jamie Wenbessen, and I am a Senior Gender Program Manager at IUCN's Human Rights and Conservation team. And on behalf of the Gender-Based Violence and Environment Linkages Center, we really want to thank you for making the time to join this webinar. Next slide, please. Now, before we continue, we do want to take a moment to be very specific and mindful of the fact that this session will address issues related to many intersecting expressions of violence, which might be uncomfortable, upsetting, or perhaps even triggering for some. So here we create a safe space, and that's our hope, to discuss these challenging topics that pervade our societies and limit our collective work. We encourage you to please take care, and we really thank you again for being here and demonstrating interest in helping end gender-based violence as a barrier for gender equality and environmental action. Next slide, please. We also have a little bit of virtual housekeeping points to share with you today. First, please note that today's session will be conducted in English, Spanish, and French. So please click on the globe at the bottom of your screen on the navigation panel and select your preferred language for interpretation. As you can see on the slide here, it's the little image of the globe that you see there. Microphones are being kept muted to minimize connectivity distractions. However, we strongly encourage you to please use the Q&A function in Zoom to send in questions so that our panelists can respond during the Q&A today. And we'll also use the same function if you experience any technical difficulties, and the team behind the scenes will help you out. And on that note, I really want to send a big thanks to the team behind the scenes and our esteemed speakers, as well as our partner, USAID, who helps make this session possible. Next slide, please. And here on the slide, we have a little bit of an overview about this webinar series. This session is organized under the Gender-Based Violence and Environment Linkages Center, which is hosted by IUCN under its Advancing Gender in the Environment Agent Partnership with USAID. Now, specifically today, we have 3 objectives for this webinar. The first is to elevate attention to gender-based violence and environment data and statistics. The second is to discuss the role of data on these interlinkages to help identify strategic actions. And the third is to contextualize data and information on GBV and how it and related data collection can inform climate change and biodiversity agendas. Next slide, please. Now, for looking at the rest of our agenda today, we'll first have opening remarks for this event to help provide a framework for today's discussion. I'll then have the privilege of sharing the inspiration for today's webinar, which are some of the data points we received, cataloged, and analyzed as a part of this year's RISE Grants Challenge call for proposals. We will then hear from 3 panel presentations before diving into a Q&A session. So again, please do send your questions for our panelists throughout today's event. And we'll then have closing reflections and updates regarding events and dialogues where you can engage with us this fall. Next slide, please. Now, it is my privilege to introduce to you a very special environmental leader. I'd like to invite Olivier Rukundo to offer us some remarks. Olivier Rukundo has over 15 years of progressively responsible experience in project and program management and policy development in the areas of biodiversity, agriculture, and sustainable development. He currently serves as the head of the Peoples and Biodiversity Unit at the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity, where he oversees all matters related to Article 8J and related provisions, as well as the Gender and Biodiversity Portfolio. Prior to his appointment at the Secretariat of the CBD, Olivier worked as a legal and technical advisor for the FAO International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture. He has also served in numerous other agencies, including WIPO, UNDP, GIZ, and IDLO. Olivier, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your remarks to help us frame today's event.
Thank you very much, Jamie. It's my distinct pleasure to be with you this morning. to provide some opening remarks for this very important webinar. I'd like to first start by congratulating the team that has put this together, as this is really a good step forward towards the implementation of the Global Biodiversity Framework and the Gender Plan of Action as we have adopted here at the Convention on Biological Diversity. As you would all recall, the Global Biodiversity Framework advances issues of human rights and women's equality and gender-based defense with regards to the environment. And it is indeed very important in this particular moment that webinars and actions such as this are held to support the implementation both of the framework and the Gender Plan of Action. With the GBF Target 23 on gender equality, the city became one of the first environmental treaty to have a specific target on women's rights. It embeds gender-responsive approach in which all women and girls have equal opportunity to contribute to the GBF objective. This includes the recognition of their equal right and access to land and natural resources, and their full and equal, meaningful, and informed participation and leadership at all levels of action, involvement, decision-making, and policy-making related to biodiversity. In addition, COP15 adopted a new 2030 Gender Plan of Action that will serve as a guide for realizing the goal of gender equality in biodiversity policy. With this webinar is timely and quite important as it supports the implementation of Section 1.5 of the GPA, which is actually linked to identifying and eliminating, prevent, and respond to all forms of gender-based discrimination and violence, in particular in relation to control, ownership, and access to sustainable use and conservation of biodiversity, including protecting women, environmental human rights defenders, and park rangers. Listening to the introduction by Jamie also indicates that the actions that are being undertaken under this program will help and are in line with the indicative action identified in the GPA as regards to developing and deploying data tools and strategies to understand and address gender-based violence and biodiversity linkages, including, of course, with a focus on human rights and the protection of women with regards to biodiversity conservation. It also is important in that we are also looking in terms of the implementation of the GPA for deliverables that provide data and knowledge, products and campaigns to support and promote the recognition of this issue as a central part in the implementation of the framework. I'd like to end my opening remarks by again thanking the team for this important webinar, for the important steps, also recognizing how difficult these issues are, and also recognizing the intricate balance that needs to strike between promoting awareness on this issue and creating a safe space to discuss these very sensitive and delicate topics. So once again, it's my pleasure to be with you, and I wish you fruitful deliberation during this very important webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Olivier. We really appreciate you and your amazing team. And the CBD Secretariat is truly a catalyst for supporting parties to advance conservation and human rights together. So we're really honored to be close partners in this particular intersection. And I think it's really crucial that we include Olivier's remarks about the policy frameworks in our minds as we dive into today's topic and presentation. Thank you again. Next slide, please. Now, I would love to introduce everyone to Laura Sabator to walk us through a quick webinar poll. Laura is a Gender Program Officer at IUCN, and she is a key expert on gender and environment data and statistics research and a key organizer of the Gender-Based Violence and Environment Linkages Center. And as this webinar is about data and information, your responses will help us assess the value of today's session and provide us insight on future programming. Laura, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jamie. Okay. I'm gonna launch the first poll. So the first question is, how would you rate your knowledge on gender-based violence and environment/climate data? So the options are 1, not knowledgeable, 2, somewhat knowledgeable, 3, knowledgeable and know where to find information, 4, very knowledgeable and able to integrate them in my work. And then 5, extremely knowledgeable and I'm a source for others. And then at the same time, we have a second question that I see many of you already responding, and it's, how would you rate your knowledge on approaches to measure and understand information on gender-based violence and environment or / climate linkages? And we have the same. 1 is not knowledgeable, 2 somewhat knowledgeable, 3 knowledgeable, and I know where to find practical information. 4 very knowledgeable and able to integrate them in my work, and 5 extremely knowledgeable and I'm a source for others. So we're gonna keep this open for maybe 15 more seconds, and then we will be closing once we have a good response rate. If you haven't responded yet, please do so now, and because I'm about to close the poll for now. And just saying thank you so much, everybody, for inputting your questions, your responses. As Jamie said, we always in our webinars like to collect data on the impact of our work and how we can support you in the work that you are doing. So thank you so much for sending your questions. I'm gonna close it now. And I'm gonna quickly share the results for everybody to see. And then we can leave it here and I'll come back at the end of the session. Jamie, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Laura. We really appreciate you running this poll and helping organize this event. So next slide, please. So now we're just going to dive into a quick presentation overview, as I mentioned in the agenda. Next slide. So in 2020, IUCN published a global study on gender-based violence and environmental linkages. It was the first global study about this issue across environment sectors. And what we found is that gender-based violence is used to negotiate and reinforce existing privileges and power imbalances in accessing and controlling land, natural resources, biodiversity, and ecosystem services. These dynamics are exacerbated in the face of environmental stressors and threats, which can range from biodiversity loss to climate change impacts and also to the impacts of extractive industries. We also found that gender-based violence is used to shape and control environmental work and environmental defense. And here on the screen, you can see a couple of specific examples from the study that we conducted. Next slide, please. And based on our research, the Resilient, Inclusive, and Sustainable Environments, or as we call it, RISE Grants Challenge Fund, was established by USAID and is currently managed by IUCN. We believe that the RISE Grants Challenge is indeed a unique opportunity for environmental programs to develop practical skills and experience for environment and climate-related sectors on how to design and integrate gender-responsive programming that includes careful consideration for the safety of women, girls, and other peoples from gender-based violence. Last year's call, we received a total of 375 applications, and this year we saw a 117% increase, receiving 814 completed expressions of interest. So in these 814 completed expressions of interest in 2023, we observed information that showed us a couple of things. First, the growth in the demand for funding shows us that there is a real urgent need to address this intersection. And secondly, we heard from applications about a wide range of issues and learned about many different data points that were previously either not well known or widely publicized, or were newly identified by the organizations conducting the expressions of interest themselves. So in the next slides, what I will do is present a brief summary region by region of data and information that is new and or previously not well understood or well shared and known that came to us through this year's call for proposals. I will say before we dive into it that there are quite a lot of information and data points in the slides. And while we won't be able to go through all of the slides together in detail, we will share a link to the slide deck after today's webinar, so you have access to them and you can review them in the time that you need. Next slide, please. So first, we'll go to Asia. 15% of all of the expressions of interest that we received this year came from this region, and most applications here cited GBV linkages in terms of climate change and or natural resource management, and you can see the data across the chart here. Next slide, please. So in large handfuls, specifically, we heard from some on how data on how climate disasters affect women's heightened exposure to gender-based violence. And regarding natural resources, we saw data that sheds light on the use of gender-based violence as a barrier for women's leadership and engagement with environmental defense, agribusiness, and extractive industries. And you'll see some data points here in that middle column on this topic. We also heard from applicants about how gender-based violence is used to prevent women from engaging in environmental livelihood initiatives. And some observations that we also wanted to highlight and note is that we also saw from Pakistan how transgender people are left behind from essential services in the aftermath of floods. And many of the key priorities for proposals from Asia focused on women's land and natural resource rights, ensuring women, and especially Indigenous women, can engage in agricultural, conservation, and environmental defense safely. Next slide, please. Just under 14% of proposals this year came from Central and South America and the Caribbean. And here you'll see there's quite an even distribution, citing agriculture, climate change, and natural resource management as the lead sectors where gender-based violence and linkages were cited. And after this, conservation and land rights constituted the next rung of thematic commonality. Next slide, please. And within these applications, in particular, we saw something very interesting, that there was a lot of data from Colombia, which helps us have a multidimensional view of interlinkages within one country. So you'll see a lot of that data interspersed here on this slide. And we also saw an example where women's leadership in renewable energy and digital access was stymied by harassment and intimidation of women and their families. And a brief summary of that story is to the right of the slide in the blue box. And I think that's important food for thought for us to consider the ways that violence and intimidation and gender-based violence is used to prevent women's engagement and leadership in climate mitigation, adaptation, and conservation. Next slide, please. In Oceania, we had a couple of proposals, and here the main topics across them focused on climate change and how they affect agriculture, fisheries, land rights, livelihoods, natural resource management, and water access issues. Next slide. And we saw some data from applicants about how violence increases in the aftermath of climate disasters, which is consistent with a lot of the prior reporting that we've seen. We also saw that climate disasters themselves impact environment-related livelihoods, such as fishing. And so you can see a story to the right that talks about how a cyclone in Fiji impacted fishing, which then contributed to increased intimate partner violence. We also found that these proposals aim to address unequal power dynamics that underpin these linkages between the environment and gender-based violence. Next slide, please. Now, the vast majority of proposals this year came from the sub-Saharan African region. The majority focused on how gender-based violence and natural resource management are linked, followed by climate change, land rights, and agriculture as key themes. Next slide. There are a couple of slides here, and I do apologize. It's quite tightly packed and perhaps a little bit difficult to read on your screen, which is why we'll share the presentation afterwards. But we received numerous accounts about the prevalence and the scale of harassment, sexual violence, and sexual exploitation that women face in fisheries, mining, agriculture, agribusiness, and salt wells. We also saw that droughts and climate-induced displacements as key drivers for increasing the risk and exposure to gender-based violence. And I, again, apologize, we won't be able to pause here for a long time, but next slide, please. And unfortunately, we saw continued documentation on the deep impacts women and girls feel in collecting and managing household and community natural resources and how it is connected to the threat of assault and intimate partner violence. We also heard from applicants about, unfortunately, the use of murder as a means for overtaking lands owned by widows, the physical destruction of women's water wells and death threats against using it by men, the sexual exploitation of girls in exchange for accessing natural resources, and the increased vulnerability that deaf women experience in the face of sexual violence and harassment when attempting to access natural resources or access help. So I think these points are also really important to remind us about the intersectionality of these topics and issues which came through the proposals. Next slide, please. In Eurasia, we had a couple of applications here as well. And here, as climate disasters such as primarily floods and droughts are becoming more extreme, they have been reported to be exacerbating economic losses and social pressures. And organizations in the region are paying more attention to the risk of increased gender-based violence associated with these pressures. So applicants mentioned domestic violence specifically as a tool to maintain the status quo of discrimination in land and natural resource management, and to also discourage women from voicing their rights. Therefore, priorities across Eurasia we saw included addressing women's discrimination, exclusion, and gender-based violence risks in natural resource management, water management, and also agriculture so they can adapt and become more resilient. An emphasis across the region was made for the need to conduct further research and build data to better understand how these interconnections exist within local contexts. In the Middle East and North Africa region, most proposals cited that climate change is quickly worsening water availability and affecting natural resources and agriculture yields across the regions. They noted how climate change and associated water shortages and food insecurity are generating stress, triggering domestic and intimate partner violence. And women are also walking longer distance to fetch water, which increases the risk of sexual violence, as noted by proposals from Yemen and Jordan. And this affects women as well as girls. Also in Jordan, we heard from a proposal that mentioned women in the formal and informal waste management sector face sexual harassment and violent abuse at workplaces, which limits their adequate engagement in the value chain. And we saw this particularly in higher positions that they reported on. And priorities in the region focused on improving women's rights, roles, and responsibilities over land and natural resources, building climate change resilience through sustainable agriculture and improved water management, clean energy, waste management, and also ensuring safety from gender-based violence in these roles. Next slide, please. So that brings us to the end of the summary, and I want to thank you so much for doing this rapid review together with me. What this information really showed us was the ways in which data provides deeper insights into the breadth and scale of gender-based violence and environment linkages in specific contexts. It also led us to think a little bit deeper about information and data and the potential they have to spur learning. Next slide, please. So in our analysis of RISE 2023 application datasets and ahead of the upcoming COP that starts at the end of this month, we have invited esteemed colleagues today to share with us more about emerging information and data about gender-based violence and environment linkages. First, you will hear from Sarah, who will present quantitative analysis on gender-based violence and climate linkages in Asia. You will then hear from Zinnia, who is leading a current RISE Grants Challenge project in Mexico on how qualitative information is shaping understanding on how gender-based violence affects people in ecotourism. And you will hear from Annie and Jocelyn about a past RISE Grants Challenge project in the DRC, where they took a mixed method approach combining quantitative and qualitative information to understand and take action on gender-based violence linkages with mines, extracting renewable energy materials. And then you will have the opportunity to ask our panel questions in a session moderated by Verona. And together we hope that you are engaged on how data can effectively tell a story that calls for action. Next slide. So now it's my pleasure to introduce all of you to Sarah Duarto Valero as the Regional Advisor on Gender Statistics in UN Women's Regional Office for Asia and the Pacific, where she manages the flagship program initiative, Making Every Woman and Girl Count, as well as the regional program, Building Back Better on Gender Statistics. Besides planning and implementing interventions to support the quality, availability, and the use of gender statistics across Asia and the Pacific, she leads the organization's work on gender and environment statistics. And prior to joining the regional office, she worked as a statistics specialist in UN Women's headquarters. And prior to that, she was a statistician at the Statistics Division of the United Nations Secretariat, the Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, and UNESCO's Regional Office for Asia and the Pacific. Sarah, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jamie, and thank you, colleagues, for having me. It's a real pleasure. And I'm very excited already seeing all the comments in the chat. So very excited to be here today. I will talk about disasters, climate change, and violence against women, and how we can leverage some of the data that's already out there to really get empirical evidence about this. So let's move on to the first slide. So the first avenue for this is really leveraging some of the official statistics that are already available. Next slide. We did this piece of analysis in 5 different countries in Asia and the Pacific, and we saw some pretty consistent results across the board, right? So we started from the thought that we knew crisis-induced stressors are really linked with violence against women and girls, right? We know this when we speak with service providers, for instance. But we also know that environment-related data questions are rarely included in violence-related surveys. So making these correlations is sometimes difficult. So what we did is we integrated geospatial data or satellite pictures with survey data to kind of make these comparisons and see whether these associations were indeed obvious, right? So our 2 research questions for this piece of analysis were, are climate-related variables associated with gender-related outcomes in general? And the second more specific questions around violence was specifically, are climate-related variables associated with the prevalence of intimate partner violence? And if so, how and where? Next slide. So as I mentioned, I will spare you some of the technical details, but basically we integrate demographic and health survey data. These surveys include information on things like child marriage rates, adolescent birth rates, prevalence of intimate partner violence, as well as socio-demographic characteristics of the population like age and ethnicity and sex, so you can control for all those factors. And we integrate this data with 3 different forms of geospatial information. That gives us variables like aridity index or drought episodes or annual rainfall or probability of flooding, etc. So now that we have all that information together, we're able to look at some of the associations between these variables. Next slide. So we see that for some indicators, the associations are very obvious, right? So things like child marriage rates, adolescent birth rates are consistently higher in the more arid clusters within countries. However, when you look at violence, the picture is not so consistent across countries. Next slide. So although in some countries we see very close associations between environment-related variables and prevalence of intimate partner violence, in others not so much. And this, we think, is because the drivers of violence against women are really complex and really context specific. So when you're looking at simple associations between 2 variables, there's a lot of noise and there's a lot of other variables that may be kind of like drawing the association in different directions, right? So we see very clear associations between drought episodes and the prevalence of intimate partner violence in Nepal. And we see also very close associations very strong associations between aridity index and intimate partner violence in Timor-Leste. So the map you see there on the picture is Timor-Leste. As you can see, the light blue dots are the clusters with the highest relative aridity, and the yellow dots are the clusters with the highest prevalence of intimate partner violence. So there's a clear association between aridity and prevalence of violence in Timor-Leste. Again, we see these associations in Timor and in Nepal, but we don't see them across the board in all the other countries, right? So we know that there's a lot of specificities there driving intimate partner violence behaviors. So we try to identify what are some of the variables that have the highest explanatory power for violence against women. And we see that these also differ across countries. So we see that in Timor-Leste and Nepal, the variables that have the highest explanatory power are distance to lakes and distance to coastlines. However, in the Philippines and in Cambodia, for instance, the highest explanatory power for environmental variables is held by rainfall, levels of rainfall. And in Cambodia, also flood risk plays an important role in kind of explaining the risk of intimate partner violence. Next slide. So, this gives us kind of like an idea that there are definitely some connections between intimate partner violence and climate-related variables, but there are too many different variables kind of explaining these connections. So it's difficult to see a concrete picture that's the same across countries, right? So what we do is now we're looking as a second step to additional data sources, right? So we look at big data. what people are Googling, what people are posting online in situations of crisis. So we're moving from a climate change to a very specific disaster context where these associations are much more direct and much more immediate. So next slide. So for this analysis, we start from the understanding that crisis-induced stressors are linked with violence against women. But also we know that crises make it really difficult to collect data through conventional means. So, immediately after a disaster, it's very difficult to run a prevalence survey for violence against women, right? So instead, we'll look at big data. Like I said, we look at what people are Googling, what people are posting on Facebook, on Twitter, on TikTok, and so on. And we ask ourselves two different questions. The first one is, are people using online spaces to search for violence against women-related information, including help-seeking information when crises arise? And the second question is, are service providers also posting more regularly, immediately or after crisis, to really reach the victims of violence against women better? Next slide. So we repeat this analysis now across countries. And the way that we do this analysis is we first identify keywords, right? So we look at the demographic and health survey questions around violence against women. We extract keywords from those questionnaires. Then we index those keywords, meaning we ask our machine learning software to identify synonyms, right? And that returns a total of 1,276 words. Then we translate these words in local languages for the countries of interest, and we share them with our country offices for them to check that all of this makes sense. That gives us a lot of different words around violence against women. And we use those words to look at Google searches, Facebook posts, Twitter posts, YouTube, and TikTok posts, right? So that gives us a lot of information around violence against women. Then we aggregate all of those searches and posts, and we classify them. So we classify the searches between general searches, like, for instance, what is violence against women, and help-seeking searches, like, for instance, what is the hotline number for violence victims? And then we look at how these searches kind of like increase or decrease over time over a period of 2 years. And we overlay this information with real life events for disasters and so on. So with cyclones, volcanic eruptions, political unrest, and COVID-19 lockdowns. And we start seeing the associations between these online violence-related searches and posts and these environmental and health crises. Next slide. So this is what we see, for instance, for Tonga, but it's a similar pattern across countries. So we see that when several crises overlap, immediately after, we start seeing significant increases in violence-related searches, right? So in the case of Tonga, you see there that when cyclones Zazu and Yasa overlap with heavy rainfall and with La Nina, there is a drop in violence-related searches, and shortly after there is a spike. And the same thing happened when there's a volcanic eruption overlapping with a tsunami and with La Nina. First there's a drop, then there is a spike. This is because in Tonga, in both instances, there were massive power cuts, and therefore people couldn't Google anything. But once the connectivity and the electricity was restored, we see spikes on violence-related searches. So this gives us some signals that clearly there is probably some violence going on, and there's much more interest in looking, seeking help really, and Googling violence-related searches. Next slide. So like I said, that was Tonga. We do the analysis across different countries, and we see very similar patterns, right? Is when overlapping crises take place, that searches increase. So this is the case of Samoa. We are able to disaggregate the data by type of violence, and we see that people are the most likely to Google around sexual violence. Partly this is probably because this is a taboo topic and people don't really like talking about it or looking for help elsewhere, so they look for help online. So again, we see the biggest spikes during the general elections in Samoa, which was a period of unrest, as well as during the COVID-19 lockdown that took place in March and April 2022. Second, after sexual violence, we see some psychological violence spikes. Again, during the COVID-19 lockdown, we see some psychological violence spikes as well. Again, this is pretty much the same pattern across countries. Sexual violence tends to be the one type of violence that's the most Googled. Next slide. And then when we look at the relative amount of searches, so we see that the bulk of the searches are actually general searches, like what is violence against women, for instance. But when we look at the prevalence of help-seeking searches versus total amount of searches, so searches like abuse helpline or domestic abuse counseling or marital abuse help, so people that are really looking for help, we see that the relative prevalence increases in some months. So this is the case of Kiribati. We see that these searches are more prevalent in March and April, which is when COVID-19 crisis and lockdowns overlap with La Niña in Kiribati. So again, we see some connections there. Next slide. And then we're also able to do a bit more of a qualitative analysis using machine learning. And we see, this is the case of Solomon Islands. When we look at posts in social media, we see that roughly 30% of the posts are people commenting on how the current laws in Solomon Islands are too lenient and do not deter people from committing violence against women. And 50% of people, 50% of posts are blaming the perpetrator's substance abuse and pornography for violence-related behaviors. We still see roughly between 5 and 10% of posts that are around victim blaming, about entrenching gender norms, and around violence-related misconceptions. So something for us to keep in mind, there's still some work to do there. We also see that when crises happen, service providers are also more likely to start posting and offering their services. Next slide. So when we look at how often service providers posts get either likes or reposts, we're able to classify the posts between high engagement service providers and low engagement service providers. And we start seeing patterns. High engagement providers are the ones that typically include direct information about how to contact or how to look for help, right? Like they make that information available right away for victims. While, next slide, low engagement service providers, if you can go to the next slide, are those that lack contact information, post information about like, we just held this workshop, or sad picture of a violence victim or so on. So that gives us some ideas about the importance of really service providers stepping up that online presence and the type of posts that they do to reach the victims. Next slide. So that's it. The information that I presented, you can find it across these 3 publications. The first one is about violence and the COVID-19 crisis. The second one is about violence and disasters. And the third one is about climate change. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sarah. We really appreciate your presentation. That really shows how information can, shed light on, potential linkages and correlations. So we really appreciate your presentation. Now, moving to a different region, Zinnia Carranza is a biologist and the founder and general coordinator of the civil society organization Espacio de Encuentro de las Culturas Originarias, ECHO, from where she works mainly in the state of Oaxaca with actions of local development, environment, mitigation, and adaptation to climate change. Her work has focused on rural communities, mainly indigenous, in territorial planning, natural resource management, local capacity building, productive projects, solidarity economy, integrated disaster risk management, and climate change, all with territorial rights, intercultural, and gender approaches. She is also the national president of the Climate Change Council, Mexico's representative to the International Network of Climate Change Councils, member of Mexico's National Advisory Committee on the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy in Latin America, and a member of the Working Group on Just Energy Transition in Latin America. Zinnia, we welcome you to share your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Hello, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for this invitation, for having me here. I will be discussing the work that we are carrying out in Mexico in 3 different states in the southeast. This is a project that is focused on coastline communities and community tourism in these areas. Next. what we have identified is that climate change and its effects are affecting the livelihoods of people engaged in tourism, and that this is so because the water that is very relevant for the activities and the biodiversity and the resources that are being used have been degraded and modified. The effects of climate change in biodiversity are altering the distribution and the structure of various wildlife species or fauna species that include crustaceans, amphibia, birds, fish, and these species, when we talk about nature-based tourism with guided visits, are causing an impact in biodiversity and on the livelihoods of the people that are engaged in these activities. In this sense, this climate deterioration is creating more and more polarization in the groups that are dedicating themselves to these activities because there is an increased competition, and somehow it is also having an impact on discrimination and women violence against women. Next, please. So we can see this violence reflected on the economy, the economic conditions of families upon different natural disasters like hurricanes, mean that they are left without work because, as I mentioned, they are involved in coastal tourism, and specifically women, because they are heads of the family, like single moms, and they suffer these consequences much more or more so than the families that are integrated families that have husband and wife, father and a mother. So because women are alone, and this means that they have to carry out other activities to lead their families. On the other hand, with this environmental deterioration, there is a certain polarization and inequality in the competition because women are relegated to activities that have a lesser impact on development. For instance, they are relegated to care activities, cooking, cleaning, administrative activities, and upon these disasters, they have a higher workload because they are taking care of the household and including these activities that I mentioned, and also overcoming the disaster. And this also happens within the structure of community tourism, and when they have to carry out activities that are not remunerated or without a salary. Because as we mentioned, when they are in charge of care activities, they are not receiving salaries and they need to lead the family. So we were also able to identify that there is certain psychological violence that increases, and there is a mistreatment of the women that work in this sector, in particular when there are family businesses. Men can insult them, shout at them, and men are thought to be the persons that have to lead the activities, and women are defamated and relegated. So this was reported in several locations where there are family businesses engaged in coastal tourism. This was also mentioned before, but here in turn, family violence increases during extreme weather events. This is documented by the DIF. The DIF is an organization in Mexico that works with families and on families and childhood. In Mexico, we see an increase in these situations after climate disasters, and something that happens very frequently are cyclones, like hurricanes, storms, and these, of course, impacts the welfare of the families and the development of their daily activities. Something that's also very important is institutional violence, because many people are provided with development opportunity, but mostly in this case are men. Men receive concessions and licenses and certifications, and this also has to do with the different gender roles, because in order to get the certification and to lead these activities at the coastal tourism area, they need time. These are time-consuming activities, and these are costly certifications, and women that now have to take care of the families don't have the time to receive training, because many are either single mothers or mothers that are in a position of care providers, and then the workload is being managed by them in the household. So,
and men are the ones that have the time to do it. Well, as I've said before, many of the most visible types of violence are the sexual violence. In these coastline areas, we have seen sexual abuse to service providers, tourist service providers, but also against tourists. And this kind of violence is perpetrated by community tourist service providers and also tourists. And as there's a polarization and there's more competition because of climate conditions, we have seen that violence has increased. And we can identify this violence against women, against girls and boys, and this is very serious, because one of the things that we witness in one of the Oaxaca coasts has to do with trafficking in humans, and mostly focused on minors. This has not been disclosed to the media or reported to the media, but much is being talked about this, and we are identifying this need. Then we also see that there is violence against the LGTB groups, and basically this violence is perpetrated by the locals. There is a sort of a cultural clash, because some people from different countries come to spend their holidays in this area, and there's a significant cultural clash. And we notice the appearance or emergence of these violent situations in many of these surrounding areas. Therefore, it is very important to start making all this visible and to start talking or spreading the word about all this. In the face of these unmet needs or complex situations that are being worsened by the lack of water, access to water, or the lack of access to land, people are trying to find some other ways to be able to meet their livelihood. And therefore, young people and children have to work. Therefore, we see violence against people who come to our area as tourists. The following, please. I will try to hurry up a little bit. There is an institutional violence that has to do with natural resources. There is a gentrification phenomena. That means that there are people that are coming from abroad, buying land to set up in this area, and they are willing to open new businesses or stores. Therefore, they are displacing mostly women towards the most marginal and poor areas, and there's an increasing competition for water, where priorities is being given to this resource to be extended to these areas that are being acquired by outsiders, by foreign people, and they are leaving women without any water. Therefore, they have to buy water to meet their basic needs. And women that are single, that are not part of a family or are a single parent family, they don't want to sell water to them, or they would sell water at a more expensive price. Some women have invented the fact that they have a husband so as to have access to water. Therefore, they are being deprived of their original places and deprived of their resources. They have to be subjected to these violent acts that affect their basic needs. Next one, please. And to conclude, this is a cross-cutting issue and that results in violence. And this cross-cutting issue is water. Water because of floods or droughts or excess of water that is related to cyclones or hurricanes. There are not public policies with a gender perspective to see to these violent acts, because this violence is normalized or is not being made visible. And there are no systems that provide protection and care to women that are subject to physical and sexual violence. And there are no clear mechanisms to report these violent acts and that they can be rapidly punished or penalized. Therefore, if someone suffers from violence, he would make a report and then go back to the area and becomes a victim, and therefore this sort of a vicious circle. Therefore, from our viewpoint, it's important or vital to make things visible, to take actions, and to start generating public policies and mechanisms that would allow for the advocacy and defense of the rights of women to avoid and prevent this violence. Thank you very much.
Wow, thank you so much, Zinnia, for that very powerful call to action, and we completely agree. Next slide, please. Great. And so again, kindest thanks and gratitude to Zinnia for her presentation. And I'm sure that we all have many questions for both her and Sarah. So please do continue to send us questions in the Q&A function. We are collecting them for the Q&A after this last presentation. Now, Annie Sinaduku Mwange is the Director and Provincial Coordinator of Action for the Grassroots NGO Safeguarding of Abandoned Children and Women, ASEFA. She is also the National Coordinator for the Réseau National des Femmes dans les Mines, RENAFEM. She is a leading activist advocating for the rights of women, children, and other marginalized populations in the eastern mining provinces from the DRC, and is a rural development technician. She has long-standing experience working to provide support to survivors of sexual violence in mining contexts, while continuing to fight against the root causes of violence against women, children, and girls in the DRC. Ms. Mwange is proud to have been part of the first cohort of RISE grantees, leading a project that raised the voices of women for human rights and environmental protection in artisanal mining areas in the 3 mining provinces of North Kivu, South Kivu, and Maniema. She has traveled to Cameroon, Nairobi, and across the African region to share her experience and expertise related to supporting women's rights. We'll also hear from Dr. Jocelyn Kelly, who is the director for Harvard Humanitarian Initiative's Gender Rights and Resilience, or GR2 program, where she implements projects to examine issues relating to gender, peace, and security in conflict-affected and climate-fragile environments. Her work focuses on understanding and preventing gender-based violence and human trafficking in complex crises, with an emphasis on strengthening mechanisms for resilience and social cohesion in these settings. She has given briefings related to gender and security to the United Nations Security Council, the U.S. State Department, USAID, and the World Bank, OFDA, the Woodrow Wilson Center, and the U.S. Institute of Peace. Annie and Jocelyn, nous vous accueillons à voix ouverte. Over to you.
Merci, merci de nous avoir accordé la parole. Et là, moi, je commence. Jocelyne va prendre la deuxième partie de l'interprétation. Mais sinon,
thank you very much. Jocelyne will take on the second part of the presentation. Other than that, I'm delighted. I'm delighted to be part of this webinar, and we will deliver our presentation with regards to our work. And please bear with me because our internet connection is not so good. So we carried out this activity in human rights and women protection, as well as the protection of environment. We started in 2020 or by 2021 with the support of USAID. And with regards to that, we are going to give you a little bit of background of what we are doing here, because we have to address the issue of inequality between genders and climate change. So these are the two major issues that we face on the planet. Also, there is an issue of supply of energy supply at the global level, and this can also help us to achieve the protection of climate change. So these three minerals that we call the treaties are also important. So there is also the treaty minerals are critical for green energy and moving to net zero. There's also the demand for these treaties ore that are set to increase by 500% in the next 3 decades. So with reference to that, we would like to inform you that 70% of the treaty minerals come from DRC. They are coming from DRC. In addition, women represent 50% of the labor force. So that's some information related to the next slide. Let me tell you that women account for 50% of the labor force in the exploitation of these treaty minerals. However, women face high levels of exploitation and abuse. So women are highly exposed to exploitation and abuse, despite the fact that they account for 50% of the labor force. Now, what is the question? The question is, how can the shift to clean minerals occur in a fair and equitable way? That is the question. Because we are facing this phenomenon here, we have 50% of women part of the labor force, but at the same time, they face high levels of exploitation and abuse. So it is in that regard that when we decided to carry out the project, okay, I'm really sorry. As I told you, I have some internet glitches. So in that regard, the team that carried out this project has also conducted a study to understand the needs of the women in the mining cities. And with regards to these studies, the results that came out is that 17% of women in mining towns think they have the right to work as miners. So most of them are underinformed. Additionally, one in seven women were forced to trade sex to access work in the mines. So 1 in 3 women stated they had experienced sexual harassment in the mines. And only 1 in 4 women had ever discussed abuse or harassment with other women. So as we know that we are going to implement this project in the provinces, we had to set up an approach. So we decided to create a women-led and evidence-based intervention because this will lead to resourceful empowerment of this population that has a low level of income. Additionally, we also have to have a human-centered approach. So what we mean here is that the human will be at the center of everything that we're going to carry out in terms of activity, because the human is the driving force of all of this. That's why it has to be at the center of this approach. Another thing is related to training. As we know that training is cost effective, it is also sustainable and replicable, because when we set up a small group of beneficiaries, this small group of beneficiaries will disseminate this information to a major group within the community, and in turn, they will also relay this information to the others. So we have trained 3 women, and behind these 3 women, each of them have the possibility to train 3 other people, and these 3 new people in turn can train 3 other people. So if you have 3 first beneficiaries, although you targeted only 3 people, with this approach that I described, it will reach more than 70 people. So that's why we think this is a profitable approach. Additionally, visual materials facilitates comprehension. As you can see on the picture, when we implemented the project in 2020 or 2021, what happened is that thanks to the visual material, we could explain the subject before the facilitators started explaining. And you could see that from the picture, the beneficiaries could already understand the message before it was explained to them by the facilitators, and we reaped a lot of benefits and results from this. We've also used another method, which is an inclusive method. that ensured that women and marginalized groups were included in design. And they were all at the center of our activities. So when it comes to our approaches and what I wanted to present, let me tell you that this project will be implemented in the 3 major provinces that we discussed during my presentation. And we also have 5 partners, 5 implementing partners of this project. We have ASEFA, which is the spearhead in the implementation of the project, and they are in charge of this project in the province of Myanmar. We also have another organization charging that will lead the project in North Kivu and another one in the South Kivu. RENAFEM is supposed to disseminate the information with the other networks of women at the national level and even at the international level. So at the national level, we want to enable these women to take ownership of this project and to ensure the sustainability and the buy-in of this project on the different sites. As I told you, it's going to be taken up on all these 3 sites, but with RENAFEM will ensure the dissemination of this information. HHI will have the responsibility for the monitoring of this project, for the evaluation and learnings of this study. So I would like to thank you for your kind attention, and I would like to turn over to Jocelyn. In the same time, let me
Thank you so much, Annie. So I'll just talk about some of the results that we got from implementing this resourceful empowerment teaching kit. Next slide, please. So we implemented this community-based curriculum across 3 provinces among 720 total participants. We conducted quarterly trainings coupled with self-organized action groups. And one thing that we wanted to do, because this was a new intervention and we still didn't know exactly which parts of it would be most effective, is to actually create 2 versions of this curriculum. We randomly assigned groups to either a standard version or what we thought of as an interconnectedness group. And the interconnectedness group covered all of the subjects and materials that Annie just described so eloquently, but we also undertook a lot of exercises to promote empathy, to help people acknowledge the interconnections among themselves as community members and between humans and the environment. And so I'm happy to connect with people after this presentation to talk more about the interconnectedness version. But just so you know, for the purposes of the presentation, we randomly assigned people in different communities to one of these 2 versions. And finally, we undertook a pre-survey and a post-survey to kind of track the change over time and what we saw this intervention achieve. Next slide, please. So what did we find? Overall, across all of the sites in all of the different versions of the curriculum, we found a 150% increase in the knowledge of good practices for land recovery post-mining. Women being told that they didn't belong in mining towns and refused work fell from 26% to 10%. Agreement that men and women deserve equal pay increased from 49% to 64%. And gender equitable attitudes increased, closing the gap between men who had lower gender equitable attitudes and women who tended to have higher gender equitable attitudes. Next slide, please. We also found really wonderful actions undertaken by the community action groups that really took their projects forward in ways that we didn't anticipate or expect. When people were asked to change one thing about their community over the course of the year, we found that men and women began helping each other launder ore at the sites, a difficult and time-consuming task that before had been only relegated to women. We found that male champions encouraged the creation of women's economic cooperatives, which is a powerful tool for economic independence. We found that men nominated women to leadership positions, and that nomination was really powerful coming from men. And that community members undertook successful advocacy to get equal pay for equal work among men and women in mining towns, a problem that we know exists across countries across the globe. Now, what about that randomization, those two different versions of the curriculum? Next slide, please. This is where we saw something truly remarkable happen that was unexpected, and we never would have known if we hadn't had the data to track these changes. We found that only in the communities randomized to the interconnectedness group did violence drastically decrease. Women self-reported that the sexual harassment they faced fell from 32% to 19%, and sexual coercion halved from 12% to 6%. Next slide, please. So the takeaways are that we should support women-led initiatives that draw on evidence-based practice and actively engage men, that we should invest in scalable, replicable interventions, that we should explicitly link environmental outcomes with human outcomes, as we did in the interconnectedness version. And this allows communities to self-identify their own needs and goals through action committees. So we found that data informed the creation of the project. We used intensive qualitative and quantitative M&E during the conduct of the intervention, and we closed with a survey to complement the baseline survey. This revealed pressing challenges that shaped our program. It helped us adapt our activities throughout. It elevated the expertise of our partner communities, and particularly the voices of women. And it pointed the way forward for us to incorporate surprising and promising approaches into our future work. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Annie and Jocelyn, for that amazing presentation. It's very helpful insights on how qualitative and quantitative information can help inform actions taking place. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Verona Colantes. Verona is a senior gender specialist at the Global Environment Facility. She is privileged to convene the GEF Gender Partnership, whose members comprise gender focal points of the 18 implementing agencies of the Global Environment Facility and the gender focal points of the conventions that the Global Environment Facility serves. Prior to joining the Global Environment Facility, Verona advocated for the integration of gender perspectives in the Rio Convention's processes as intergovernmental specialist at UN Women. Let's please welcome Verona. Verona, over to you.
Thank you, Jamie, and to all the panelists. It's really very enlightening and so much information, and there's so many questions. I know we have a very limited time, but I hope that many of the questions and requests would be to make available the presentations to the participants, and I think because we have maybe about 20 minutes of time for questions, I would just ask the panelists to perhaps look at the questions and get back with the specific answers to some of them, because we can't cover all of them. But what I would like to do now is kind of pose a more general question that we got from different participants, and they're appreciative of all the presentations. The question, one of the more common question was on how do we, based on what you have done, UN Women, and also the more case community-based work that the rest of the panelists did, one of the questions is, how do we make sure that what you have done so far can be extended or expanded in other regions and wider subset of the population, so that it can inform policy, global policy, and also future programming. So it's kind of like a general question for the panelists. And I would say, if one or two panelists can maybe pick up that question, and we can proceed to take some other questions. Would Sarah maybe want to start?
Thank you so much, Verna. So some of the data that I presented today are official statistics and some are not. And I would say for the big data analysis, it's able to give us some really interesting signals of what's happening, but it's just big data analysis in the sense that it's social media data, it's internet data. So it's very helpful to understand that patterns are changing over time, right? So it's very helpful to give us some ideas that there is a problem and the problem is getting worse during times of crisis, but it's impossible for this data to give us an accurate picture of how many women exactly are being victims of violence and, you know, which parts of the country these people are living in and so on. So I think for policy, there are some limitations there. I would say the data is really useful to inform, for instance, the action of service providers for violence against women services, right? So say we are able to see the service providers really try to offer their services a bit more in times of crisis, but they are not very successfully reaching the victims, right? So something I didn't mention in the presentation, for instance, that we see is that when people Google for help, they often get results from a different country. Like, you know, they're Googling for help in the Pacific somewhere and they're getting results for Australia, right? So that's not very helpful for victims of violence. So working on search engine optimization is very important for service providers, for instance. We also saw that high engagement and low engagement service providers. So again, these findings can help us understand what changes the service providers need to make in the way they offer services at times of crisis. But I would say some of this big data analysis is a bit too premature to inform policies on their own, right? So it's just signals for now. It's not really kind of like comprehensive and representative data. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Would Tinia or Annie, Jocelyn want to come in on that question? Any one of you?
I can, briefly intervene to kind of build on Sarah's point and a point that I think was in the chat about what are the global trends or commonalities that we see across these projects and across the work that IUCN has done. And I think we know now, of course, right, the negative impacts of climate change are gendered, and that the first and most severe impacts of climate change disproportionately affect women because they manage access to food, water, and energy within their households and their communities, and they depend on natural resources for their livelihoods. And despite this, women are disproportionately excluded from being recognized as leaders, activists, and change makers in the fight to, or the effort to combat climate change. And I think that's a pattern that we see over and over again. I think IUCN and USAID's and UN Women's work is trying to flip that entire dynamic on its head and acknowledge that women are the leaders, the experts, the people who are at the forefront of all of this work. And I think if there's a commonality across these presentations and the work of everyone that we've heard from, it's this attempt to make sure that the voices of women are, really at the forefront instead of being kind of ignored, which, we have seen happen in the past as we try to confront global challenges.
Thank you. Another set of questions, and this probably for Tinia and Annie. There's this whole question relating to, the issue of cultural versus structural violence. So, do you really want to distinguish these two, or based on the communities you've worked with? Is there really, does it make sense to distinguish between cultural and structural violence, or do you see that they are actually interlinked and should be addressed like at the same time? Tinia or Annie? Because you worked with communities, so I presume there's more insight there based on what you've seen.
Yes, from the experience that we've had, there is an important cultural clash.
y a un problème. C'est ce qui prime, c'est la violence culturelle. C'est-à-dire, ce problème-là, culturellement, les communautés ont une mauvaise interprétation sur la femme par rapport à l'accès dans les sites miniers. Il y a un problème au niveau de la culture. Puisque au préalable, la femme n'a pas accès à la forêt, la femme n'a pas accès à une portion de terre, la femme n'a pas accès d'aller dans les sites miniers. Puisque pour aller dans les sites miniers, il faut avoir une portion de terre. Aussi, la coutume a même refusé à la femme d'accéder à une partie de la forêt. Comment elle va accéder? Maintenant aussi, par rapport à nos lois, bien sûr, nos lois donnent l'opportunité à la femme d'accéder dans les miniers, c'est essentiellement d'atteindre 18 ans et d'avoir les documents, tout ça, la femme doit avoir l'accès. Mais aussi, il y a problème de violence.
There is also a problem for women and the presence of women in the media as well. It is a type of not a good thing if she's going to be working in the political sphere or anything like that. It is something which is going to be well regarded by the members of the community. So they do find that women are not well enough to be working in this type of sphere. So I have worked a great deal with the different chiefs in our village. We have collaborated a great deal with them. And then again, this is going to enable us to provide the possibility to women to have access to this type of position, as well as to have access to the lands as well. And we need to highlight that and say also that women are members of the community, they are human beings, and they need to be eligible to have the right to the land and to explore the land. Women have been marginalized. They have always had several problems, and this is why women seems to be rather frustrated, even within their own family. When they distribute the lands, women are excluded, stating that one day she is going to get married and she is no longer going to have the right to this, and she's going to give birth to children who would belong to another family indeed. So there is this type of customary issue, the traditions that needs to be dealt with the chief of the village in order to enable women to have access to the land. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you.
They don't even have the possibility to cultivate. Thank you very much indeed.
Xinya, did you want to come in earlier? I thought you wanted to come in too.
Can you hear me now? Yes, what you have just mentioned is very important, because there is an intrinsic violence in every place depending on the culture the people are part of. However, this violence increases when there is a cultural clash. And this is happening in these tourist areas. People from abroad come to this area, to this sector, people who have a high purchasing power, and all this violence crops up. That is a power-related violence, and it is as well what we see here is that this violence is against boys, girls, and adolescents as well. And that is very serious, because there is sexual abuse against minors by these people who feel powerful and are powerful. And in fact, climate change is also impacting, is changing the livelihood of the people, and they have to go out to work as young as they are, young boys and girls, and they face these violent acts. And this is also what women are experiencing when people from abroad come, that there's sexual harassment, that there's sexual abuse perpetrated by them, and economic exploitation, and they are deprived of their goods and assets and their livelihood. Therefore, all this is extremely important, and very little is said about all this. We need to put this forward for discussion because we need to see how to face this violence that is being suffered by these people within their communities, and now they are also affected by this violence that comes from outside. And therefore their human rights are jeopardized and violated.
Thank you, Tina and Annie. That's really, coming from your experiences working with the victims and in communities. This is really very impactful. There is this related question based on what you've already shared, which is on behavioral change. So we're looking at culture, norms, and the role of leaders, including religious leaders and leaders in the communities, chiefs, and so on. But there's also a role for the government and other actors. So the question, there was a question relating to behavioral change. So now we have this information that you just shared with us, very powerful information, both in terms of data, but non-official data, and the role of doing the big data, for example, that Sarah mentioned, but also Jocelyn, you shared something about some of the intervention pathways. Somebody in the chat mentioned that. So given all what we already know, like what do you think should happen or should be done so that we can also, now that we have this qualitative and quantitative information, how can we move a little the needle for this behavioral change to happen so that it does not become an excuse that because you're a woman or of different gender that you suffer from this violence in doing conservation work and other related actions for the environment. Maybe Jocelyn, you can start with that question.
Yeah, thank you so much. So I think what we've seen is that there's this increasingly rich qualitative and quantitative data identifying the problem and identifying promising avenues for intervention. And then data has a role once you create or test an intervention to continue to inform your feedback loop, figuring out what works, figuring out what needs to change, and of course, informing adaptations from place to place, not only from country to country, but from community to community. Not every program is going to have the same impact, and data helps us understand that and adapt. And I will also say, what we saw with the resourceful empowerment intervention is that data also helped us find these kind of unexpected and beautiful pathways for impact, where we understood that turns out empathy and interconnectedness could be a promising path forward. And we're going to hopefully really dig into those findings as we continue our work going forward. And so I think the opportunity to have data within programming really helps us continue to improve and elevate the voices of women in communities who are doing this important programming.
Thank you. And any other panelists who may want to come in on the issue of behavioral change? Like how have you done it, integrated it in your own interventions in the communities to move slightly the needle so that we have some of this behavioral change at the level of communities, but also maybe at the governmental level in terms of national policy? Yes, Tinia?
Yes, I would like to mention something that has been very relevant: to work together with the authorities, with the local authorities, to work jointly with municipalities. Because what I have just commented is that many of the people who were part of the government were not aware of all this. Therefore, starting to work on local actions to face these problems is very important, but it is also important to work at all the other levels. We need to create mechanisms that are feasible because we have laws, we have a structure, but to put it into practice and to set it in motion is quite complex. And that's something that we lack. That's why there's so much impunity and so many acts go unpunished, because mechanisms are sluggish, are complex. And in order to move forward, there's nothing so far that would allow us to provide care to the victims and to do justice. Therefore, that is something we need to delve in. I don't know what things are like in other countries or what the situation is like, but I assume it could be quite similar. Therefore, these rapid action mechanisms should be in place, and we need to have expeditious justice. These are fundamental issues, and we need to work together internationally. Therefore, this can become a global policy.
Thank you. Thank you to all our panelists. Would there be anyone else who would like to come in with maybe your last thoughts? I know we have to wrap up, but if you have any last thoughts for our audience, whether it's on how we use all of this data so that we influence global policy. I'm just looking at the chat, and that's really another one of the main things that come up. And then questions about how have we or you, how have you seen by having this data that it actually made a difference in crisis situations? That's also one interesting question. Is there anything you can share that by making available data that actually it made a difference when responding to crisis, some actual crisis, humanitarian crisis maybe? So just one or two points. Anyone? Sarah?
Maybe thank you. So I was just gonna say, so two thoughts. I'll respond first to your question about crisis. This is not an example of violence against women, but it's an example of how crisis data can really help in situations of crisis, basically. We run rapid gender assessment surveys. So these are surveys with anywhere between 3,000 and 15,000 respondents in situations of crisis to see what the situation is around many different topics, right? So during the COVID-19 crisis, for instance, we ran these surveys just a week after the pandemic was declared to see what was happening to women and men. And we noticed, for instance, that a lot of the countries that were providing subsidies to unemployed people, they were not providing subsidies to those people that were in informal jobs, and they lost their informal jobs, right? So as a result of the data, actually governments in some countries stepped in and set up these stipends and kind of subsidies and so on for people that were working in informal jobs as well. So just an example that sometimes when you have the data in the right moment and really clearly showing what's going on, it can really help address the situation. In the context of violence against women data, like I said, normally because of the type of data that we are collecting, that we're reprocessing from big data, we typically work with service providers rather than governments directly, just because we know the data is incomplete, right? It's not an estimate of prevalence right now. But that has also been helpful to help service providers really tailor their outreach strategy to victims during crisis. So we've done a lot of training, and that has resulted in much better outreach. So that's, we are hearing from service providers that they get more referrals and so on. So that's helpful. They're reaching more victims in context of crisis. My second thought was around the use of data for policy and when to use and when not to use it and so on. And I would say the good news is that there is increasing evidence on the connections between violence against women and the environment, increasing empirical evidence, like when we already have a lot of other types of evidence, of course. but governments in particular are increasingly interested in actually having this empirical evidence. So they are investing in really collecting this data through official statistics, through specialized surveys. So we support a lot of countries with implementing gender and environment surveys. These surveys cover all kinds of topics around the connections between individuals and the environment and how they interact with the environment. And they include some semi-violence questions. We are not able to ask direct intimate partner violence questions because these are not specialized surveys, so it would be risky for the victims to be asked these questions. But we ask questions around whether people have experienced worsening safety since a certain disaster happened, for instance, or whether they have noticed increases in crime in their community and so on. And that is able to give us nationally representative estimates of these kind of like pointers that really point to a much bigger problem. So that is much more powerful data than big data, for instance, that we may able to obtain from whoever's using the internet, which is only a fraction of the population. So just flagging that the good news is that there's a lot of work now ongoing and a lot of government interest to really get this data going. So I guess that's good news, and we would be able to kind of like use it a bit more extensively to inform policy down the line. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think that was really comprehensive, your response, and we are unfortunately at running out of time. And thank you very much for everyone who stayed on. I personally learned a lot from this presentation, and for my work in particular. I mean, previously, I worked on influencing global policy, and I think what was presented today, and also the work of IUCN and through USAID, is really a very important contribution that is, it builds the case. We always say it's important to build the case. And it's important both for policy and programming. And now that I'm on the side of the Global Environment Facility, I'm also starting to see many projects that are being submitted for funding, having some more and more reference to GBV, but then only as a reference. So this information that you are sharing today will actually be very important in raising awareness for people who are for implementing agencies who are developing programs on how to better capture gender-based violence and really incorporate the interventions in their projects and address this gender-based violence, rather than just mentioning it in the context or mentioning it in the project description or in their gender analysis. So with that, I'm just really here to thank you for all your presentations and all these very interactive discussions. To the audience, to the participants, there's so many questions, by the way, and which shows the interest, very substantive questions. And apologies if we were not able to answer all of them. I'm sure IUCN will have a way to reach out to all of you. And I pass it on now to them, to Laura, for some remarks and some closing as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Verona, and just everybody, because we are out of time, I'm just gonna launch the polls. Is the same to as before, and a final one that notes was this webinar helpful? So I'm just gonna launch the polls while Jamie will be closing. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Verona for the moderation and closing remarks, and also to Laura for launching this poll. And as Laura said, while you are all filling out this exit poll, I just want to say thank you again to everyone for joining us today. And I also want to say that I hope that session also informative, and to let you know that again that you can find many of people that you saw on this day that will be happening well, and we thank you again for your time and attention to helping understand and address gender-based violence and environmental linkages. It's your attention and your efforts that are close gaps and to ensure safety of people from gender-based violence to pay in and lead environmental sustainability. So again, thank you so much for answering our poll. It helps us a lot with learning about, the organization of these sessions. Do apologize, we weren't able to get to everything, but we will be sending an email very soon with the recording for this event, some of the documents and resources and presentations that were shared during this event, and we hope that you all stay tuned. Thank you.